Cambridge University's Cavendish Laboratory. That's the posh name for the physics department. J.J. Thomson has a glass tube and 2 electrodes. One is positively charged, the other negatively charged. The green, mysterious fluorescent glow appears. Picking up where Edison left off, he's able to bend it with a magnet, but Thomson goes much, much further. He shows that this ray carries kinetic energy when it heats up a small piece of metal. Then when Thomson applies electric fields, he can determine the mass. But his calculations surely cannot be correct, because if they are, it means whatever's in there is not atomic, but rather subatomic. Years before the electrification of society, before the telephone arrived, but a few years after Morse invented the telegraph, and right in between the publication of Frankenstein and Dracula, those 2 novels that bookend the most important century humanity has ever passed through, a French novelist writing with remarkable foresight saw something on the horizon of humanity's future. It wasn't a telegraph pole. That's how Chapter 4 of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines opens. And of course, I'm talking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the French author is Jules Verne. Captain Nemo, that's the captain of the Nautilus, is shown around Professor Pierre Aronnax. On the tour of the Nautilus, the captain tells Aronnax, "There's a powerful, obedient, swift and effortless force that can be bent to any use which reigns supreme aboard my vessel. It does everything. It lights me, it warms me, it's the soul of my mechanical equipment. This force is electricity." The bending of electricity to Nemo's whim is a combination of 2 different things. The first is electrical engineering, and that's the world of Edison, capacitors, resistors, wires. But the second is electronic engineering, the manipulation of electricity on such a small scale that it could be used to control machines almost invisibly, almost miraculously. Welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. My name is Jamie Dobson. We're going to be picking up today where we left off last time with Thomas Edison and, of course, his minor altercation with Alexander Graham Bell. We're going to be, however, talking about 3 specific, separate, but very much related things. The first is the visionary and the rebel called Ted or Theodore Vail. Now, the name Vail might ring a bell because Alfred Vail was Ted Vail's first cousin, and Alfred Vail was Samuel Morse's assistant, according to Samuel Morse. I would say he was more a business partner who helped Morse bring the telegraph to life. The second thing we're going to talk about is the light bulb. We are finally, oh my God, we are finally leaving the Victorian times behind us and entering into a new age, not of electricity, but of electronics. How did the light bulb evolve so that Theodore Vail could plug it in to his telephone system? Thirdly, we're going to be speaking about management and leadership. The lessons are leaking out of the stories we've been talking about. And specifically, we're going to talk about how Theodore Vail created a strategy that bridged AT&T from its medieval and scrappy and scruffy past into the future, and how he did this not once, but twice. By doing this, we're going to see that the challenges technology companies had 120 years ago are exactly the type of challenges technology companies are having right now. Where did things start for Theodore Vail? They started a few hundred years earlier when Thomas Vail, a religious exile, landed in America in 1647. He married Sarah Vail, an intelligent woman. We know this because a magistrate sentenced her to wear her tongue in a cleft stick, which was a punishment for beating a man in an argument. A couple of generations later, the descendant of Thomas Vail and Sarah Vail, Davis Vail, moved to Morristown. That was in 1783. Morristown, that may sound familiar, was George Washington's winter encampment. He launched the Battle of Princeton and the Battle of Trenton from Morristown. Davis had 2 sons, Stephen and Louis. Stephen's son was Alfred Vail, Samuel Morse's partner and the practical set of hands that Morse desperately needed. Lewis's son was Theodore. Theodore Vail was Alfred Vail's first cousin, but they came from a big family, so they were born decades apart. Davis was Theodore's grandfather. Alfred came of age in the time of the telegraph. That's important. We can think of him as being telegraph native. But Theodore came of age in the time of the telephone. These are two extremely important distinctions. Now, unlike Edison, Theodore Vail received a pretty good education. His main interest was natural philosophy, he loved chemistry, and he loved astronomy. He wasn't particularly good at maths, but he was very good with his hands. Therefore, when it came to fixing farm machinery and later electrical machinery, Theodore Vail was gifted naturally, so it seemed. Vail also liked reading. This reading, however, led him to a crisis. Using $1 he'd been paid for some work he did for an uncle, he picked up a book called The Light and Shadows of Real Life. The book was about a man who was always dreaming big, always had plans, but never found the tenacity to see them through. The book confronted Vail with the question, what if I'm like this man, full of plans but without the tenacity to pull them off? This tells us two things about Vail. Number one, he was ambitious, he was thinking big. And number two, no doubt related, he was insecure. What if those ambitions could never be realised? What if he was a flake? What if he was the next Alexander Graham Bell? He started to dream about being a lawyer, a doctor, and a preacher. And as we so often see in the history of visionaries and rebels and the machines they built, the right book had arrived in the right pair of hands at the right moment in time. Yes, but all of that reflection and reading didn't really get him very far. He ended up working in the local chemist shop. That was his first job. Not exactly high-flying, but history would now teach us that this was a remarkable moment of serendipity. The chemist doubled as the local telegraph office. So all of a sudden, Vail had in his hands a technology that spoke directly to his interests, his abilities, and his epic family history. By the time he left the chemist at age 19, he had an intimate understanding of the telegraph. He knew how to work it, he knew how to fix it, and like Edison, he could listen to the dots and dashes by ear. Soon after, the Civil War reached Morristown. Theodore wanted to sign up for military service. If his friends and neighbours were fighting and dying for the Union cause, why shouldn't he? His father, however, forbade him. Furious at his dad, Vail simply picked up and moved. He wrote a letter to his uncle who worked at Western Union, and he got him a job as a telegrapher in, of all places, Wyoming. Vail, on his very first day, discovered a dead cowboy right there next to the railway tracks, and not long after he was chased himself by Native Americans across the plains, only for the Native Americans to be chased back by the cavalry. The food was awful, the digs were awful, and his desperation, he sent off a letter to the Postal Service. When they finally got back to him, he'd actually forgotten that he'd sent the letter. They did so with an offer of employment on the Omaha to Ogden route. Theodore Vail discovered very quickly he had a knack for managing the mail service. He joined them in 1873. He rose extremely rapidly through the ranks, and by February 1876, he became General Superintendent in Washington, D.C. Therefore, only a few years had passed between landing in Wyoming and landing the very top job in Washington. February 1876, you've heard me correctly there, the exact same month that Elisha Gray and Alexander Graham Bell both submitted their patent applications for the harmonic telegraph. 2 years later, Alexander Graham Bell and Gardiner Hubbard had a series of headaches at their newly formed Bell Telephone Company. They'd managed to sell about 700 of these peculiar devices of theirs. Their infrastructure was utterly shambolic, the business was a total mess, and worst of all, after realising their earlier mistake, William Orton's Western Union entered the telephone space. Alexander Graham Bell and his father-in-law, Gardiner Hubbard, desperately needed a manager who could scale their business, a manager who understood patent law, and very importantly, a manager who understood Congress and politics and the shenanigans of Washington, D.C. Maybe most importantly of all, though, they needed a manager with vision, tenacity, and energy, who knew how to run a gigantic going concern, or at the very least knew how to build something up to become a gigantic going concern. Gardiner Hubbard offered Theodore Vail a job. But my God, why would he take it? He was a well-paid civil servant in a highly prestigious position in the very heart of Washington, D.C. Why would he give that up to join a chaotic, shambolic startup led by a rapacious lawyer and a bumbling schoolteacher who had only managed to shift about 700 of these very strange devices of theirs? The telephone had no future. Most people back then thought it was a toy. Nobody would seriously use this device. And besides, unlike the telegraph, there was no written record of what was said. It would be utterly useless, therefore, to businesses. There was, of course, that other thing, the Western Union thing. They were in the telephone space now. How could the Bell Telephone Company ever compete with them? Western Union had wired up the whole of the United States. The harmonic telegraph, the telephone, used existing telegraph infrastructure. Western Union owned all of that existing infrastructure, and they blanketed the whole of the United States with it. The only way the Bell Telephone Company were ever going to get around Western Union was to defeat them in court, to prove that the Bell Telephone Company had, in other words, exclusive rights to the patent and therefore could exploit it for the following 23 years. Vail must surely have been a little crazy to have even considered this offer. But there are two things you need to know about Vail. The first was his vision. He really did see a world where the telephone succeeded, a world where people picked up the phone to place business calls or, rather strangely, to speak to their family members. The second thing about Vail, though, was this. He hated Western Union. He hated bullies, and he hated the bully boy tactics they deployed against the Bell Telephone Company, a much smaller company. Theodore Vail accepted Gardiner Hubbard's offer of employment, and on the 27th of May 1878, he began work for the Bell Telephone Company. He immediately brought court proceedings against Western Union because they had been infringing on Alexander Graham Bell's patent. The newspaper of the time dubbed this, ding, 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 the patent battle of the century. Arguably, it was the patent battle of history. Robert Gordon, don't forget, said that the patent for the telephone was the most valuable patent ever. The court case began the following year, January 1879. It rumbled along until that moment of high drama. The letter from Elisha Gray to Alexander Graham Bell was read out loud in court. It congratulated Bell for the invention of the telephone and the winning of a race fairly won. You might remember from the other podcast, that was the moment Western Union lawyers gasped. The case was slipping away from them. Theodore Vail, he had them on the run. Western Union panicked. They began to think about a settlement. In November 1879, Theodore Vail led an all-night negotiation, and this is what he took off Western Union. All the telephones, all the switchboards, and much more importantly, all the patent rights to telephony. Theodore Vail began to build a precious walled garden around his very soon-to-be monopoly-positioned business. It was a stunning victory for the Bell Telephone Company and a stunning victory for Theodore Vail. Together, they had struck a blow against those bullies from Western Union, and 20 years later, that blow would prove to be fatal. Theodore Vail now busied himself with creating the right organisational structures for how he felt a telecommunication company should be run. Importantly, he identified the telegraph's key competitive advantage. It worked over long distances. Long-distance service for the telephone was impossible. Analogue signals, they degrade too quickly. Dots and dashes of the telegraph were easy to amplify, but strange analogue signals arising from a voice were very difficult to amplify. Letters or sounds, or sometimes whole words, were chopped off, distorted, or simply lost in the ether. Theodore Vail felt a specific and dedicated subsidiary should be put together to solve this specific problem, because if they could solve the long distance problem, then the telephone would become a genuine competitor to the telegraph. The subsidiary was called American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. This was just one part of Ted's vision for what he started to call the grand system. Bringing this system to life involved not just the use of technology, but the creation of new and novel technologies. This was Ted Vail in a nutshell. It wasn't enough to build a walled garden around his monopoly position. It had to be protected and extended by using cutting-edge technology. This was, after all, what had gotten the Bell Telephone Company and Alexander Graham Bell off to such a winning start. Some of these technologies would be developed in-house. Other technologies, though, could be acquired. Therefore, Ted Vail's idea was to aggressively defend Alexander Graham Bell's patents in court and at the same time grab as many patents or ideas as he could get his hands on. Those two things, along with developing unique inventions and ideas within the company, would be pieced together to form a grand system that didn't just serve the rich East Coast citizens of New York and Philadelphia, but served the whole of the United States as well. Where had Theodore Vail gotten this idea to build a monopoly that was protected and served the whole of the United States? He had, of course, learned that from Western Union. How wonderful does all of this sound? A remarkable vision, a fantastic strategy that Theodore Vail got busy executing to perfection. But the grand system held within it the seeds of Bell's destruction. Ted Vail's vision for his system served everybody in the United States, the small farmsteads in the Midwest and everybody in between, including in the big cities of Chicago and Philadelphia. For the next 10 years, the shareholders more or less let Ted Vail do what he needed to do. Organise the business, defend the patents, lead an amazing company, build that amazing walled garden, and create, essentially, an amazing cash-printing monopoly. This is where the conflict arose. Ted Vail believed those profits should be ploughed back into technical development to broaden the system's reach and bring more American users into the telephone system. His fellow shareholders had a very different idea. They felt every single cent of profit should be given back to them in the form of dividends. Who were all these financiers and investors who wanted their money back and then some? They were men like William Hathaway Forbes and his fellow Boston Brahmins. That's Boston's elite or highest class or caste, nicknamed from the highest caste in Hinduism. They were the guys and girls, mainly guys, who wanted regular dividend payments. This placed them on a direct collision course with Ted Vail. Vail believed in good service, building infrastructure for the long term, and sustainable long-term profits that would fund what was to become an essential public good. The financiers, the same people Thomas Edison grew to despise, thought the business was in the business of paying dividends. And therefore, despite rescuing Gardner Hubbard and Alexander Graham Bell's dumb asses, and despite diligently building up the Bell Telephone Company, in an awful act of betrayal, Theodore Vail was ousted from his position in 1886. He'd picked a fight with Boston's elite, and Boston's elite had won. The following 20 years between 1886 and 1907 saw the Bell Company run completely into the ground. By 1907, it was made up of a wild and messy collection of holding companies with bizarre shareholdings and cross-shareholdings. The org chart was as messy as the web of wires that had sprung up in New York and Chicago and all the other big cities, and it was a reflection of the messy and incoherent thinking of the men who founded and then had attempted to run the company. What the hell had been going on in the 20 years prior to this moment? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The shareholders had not changed their position. The Bell Telephone Company was a collection of patents that needed to be defended and exploited. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the man they placed in charge was Mr. John Hudson, and he was a lawyer. Hudson cared nothing for customer service. Hudson did not care about people in the cities, and he absolutely couldn't give two hoots for all the bumpkins out in the countryside. Their infrastructure was nothing more sophisticated than a wooden pole and a piece of metal with an exposed wire stuck onto it. People in the community out there shared those wires in what became known as the party line. One neighbour could pick up the telephone and eavesdrop on another neighbour's conversation. As Robert Gordon likes to point out, Those in the countryside were often the very last to benefit from technological advancements. The party line is a very good example of that. It wasn't just those stuck on the party line who despised the Bell Telephone Company. Americans already widely hated them by the 1890s when Alexander Graham Bell's patent eventually ran out. They were hated because they were unethical, litigious, aggressive, they cared nothing for their customers, and already at the time their policy was described as customer be damned. The newspapers at the time caricatured the company as an octopus, a greedy, gigantic, grasping octopus whose tentacles reached into every part of American society and strangled the life out of it. The image of the octopus was not a figment of a populist imagination. It was real. The people behind the big trusts of the day and the big companies of the day genuinely did starve the life out of American society. Many historians agree that the people behind these trusts and companies managed to place or force Theodore Roosevelt into the vice presidency because they were worried he would come after them if he ever won the presidency. Unfortunately for these rapacious elites, an assassin then shot President McKinley. Theodore Roosevelt, therefore, in a bizarre act of destiny, ascended from the vice presidency to the presidency, the one place all these greedy, grasping, money-hungry bastards did not want him to be. And thus a crackdown on monopolies began. This is a stark picture of how things looked in 1907. On the one hand, you have the business, the Bell Telephone Company. It's been run into the ground by greedy lawyers. There's been no innovation for 20 years. The company itself is hated by its customers and has become a genuine symbol for corporate greed within the United States. On a societal level, populism is on the rise. For the first time, Bolshevism or communism in the United States is rising to meet the rapacious greed of the elites. This is not a figment of my imagination. In 1904, Robert Hunter wrote a book, Poverty. It said the following: 7/8 of the families hold but 1/8 of the national wealth, while but 1% of the families hold more than the remaining 99%. So 1% of American families hold 99% of the wealth. This may seem like a modern idea, but actually the idea of the 1%ers comes from Robert Hunter's 1904 book, Poverty. Things only got worse in 1907. Stock market crashes in London and Paris that began the year before in 1906 spilled over to the United States. All of that led to the October crash in 1907. And so therefore, at that moment in time, the Bell telephone system was a mess, and so too was the American economy. In the build-up to 1907, to understand how bad things really were at the Bell Telephone Company, we can look at some indicators. Their stock price had fallen from $186 to $88. Their debt had tripled. They could not sell bonds to fund their expansion. Their competitors had 3 million phones. The Bell Telephone Company had 3.1 million phones. Their market share was therefore about 50%. What had happened? Their patents had expired. So while the lawyers and the shareholders milked the Bell Telephone Company for everything it was worth for 25 years, they let the patent expire without having any response. As the Bell telephone crisis came to a head and as 1906 gave way to 1907, we find Ted Vail on a farm in Vermont, semi-retired. Between 03 and 1906, he'd buried his mother, his brother, his wife Emma passed away in February 1905. Everything seems to happen in February in the story of the telephone. And tragically, in December 1906, his son Davis, named after his grandfather, died of typhoid fever, aged only 36. What was Ted Vail to do? And then it happened. They came begging. The Boston Brahmins, the same investors who'd betrayed him 20 years earlier. The company was in a worse state than Theodore Vail could have ever imagined. The market share had collapsed. The competitors were absolutely killing the Bell Telephone Company. Theodore Roosevelt is breaking up monopolies, and in Europe, many telephone companies had already been nationalised. And so they begged him to come back come back and save the Bell Telephone Company like you had done 20 years earlier. Should Vail take the job? His sister told him, don't bother, enjoy your retirement. Vail turned around and said to her, I must take it. It is the crowning thing of my life. Then it all started to happen. May the 1st, 1907, JP Morgan installs Vail as president of the Bell Telephone Company. Vail then gets busy. His annual report, 6 or 7 months later, is candid. We've seen this before, haven't we? The strategist is honest about conflict, because without conflict, a strategy cannot emerge. And so Vail tells his people, we will lay our cards on the table. There is never anything to be gained by concealment. And thus the games begin. The first thing Vail did was get rid of all the lawyers. To them, the Bell Telephone Company was never anything more than a collection of patents that needed to be defended. They had no idea about invention and innovation. Theodore Vail wanted engineers. He then, rather cannily, used the 1907 October crash to justify cost-cutting. This was the initial blast of work and restructuring of 1907. He then started to replace the lawyers with what I describe as telephone native engineers. What do I mean by that? Vail needed engineers who came of age, not in the time of telegraphy, but in the time of telephones. Vail wanted, in other words, men just like he once was. We can summarise the first 6 months of Vail's return, therefore, as being about strategy making sure there was a conflict from which the strategy can emerge, cost-cutting, and specifically systematically replacing lawyers with telephone native engineers. 1908 was a different story altogether. This is the beginning of negotiations with the federal government. This is the beginning of what would become the Kingsbury Commitment. The Kingsbury Commitment was all about agreeing with the government that AT&T, I need to explain this, I think, AT&T was the new name for the Bell Telephone Company, because in a bizarre piece of legalistic jiu-jitsu to get them out of trouble, the subsidiary AT&T that was originally created to solve the long-distance problem acquired all of the Bell Telephone Company. When Theodore Vail returned then in 1907, the Bell Telephone Company was actually officially AT&T already. The Kingsbury Commitment was about the public setting of prices, profit and service levels. Samuel Insull, Thomas Edison's protege, came to a conclusion a few years earlier. The electricity grid would be better for everybody if it was allowed to run as a natural monopoly. The only way a monopoly was ever going to be allowed to be in private hands was if the prices, service levels and profits were set by and in conjunction with the government. Vail learnt this from Insull. He wanted to do exactly the same for AT&T. In fact, he thought the only way to avoid nationalisation was to do this. This all got wrapped up and became the Kingsbury Commitment, which was eventually ratified in 1913. There was a second part to the Kingsbury Commitment. It was about divesting from Western Union. Oh my God, you have heard that correctly. In a remarkable reversal of fate and fortune, don't forget originally Alexander Graham Bell and Gardner Hubbard offered all of the patent rights for the telephone for only $100,000 to William Orton. Orton, of course, said no. That led to the epic court case which Bell and Hubbard won. That was the David and Goliath battle, the patent battle of the century. William Orton said no because his engineers told him the telephone would never be a thing. It was a toy, it was useless. Well, once they'd won the court case, the Bell Telephone Company eventually caught up with Western Union and acquired a controlling stake in 1909. The Kingsbury Commitment, however, asked the Bell Telephone Company, or AT&T, to divest their interest in Western Union, so it reversed the 1909 acquisition. Therefore, by 1913, we've got the telephone native engineers back in the business. The lawyers have gone, and the federal government is off Theodore Vail's back. What about technology? That was the third big part of Vail's strategy. AT&T had stagnated for 20 years. They hadn't invented anything. They had made no progress whatsoever with the long-distance telephone call problem. That was why AT&T was originally created. It had not shifted even 1 inch. 20 years had passed. Long-distance telephone calls were still not possible. Around technology then, Theodore Vail had a 3-pronged approach. Number 1, Standardization. There were no standards at the time in the United States. Nuts and bolts and screws and screwdrivers didn't match each other. Now, they may have matched depending on which state you were in, but if you moved from one state to another and took your screwdriver with you, you might be sad to discover that it didn't work. So standardization was not even a thing on the national level. For the system, the Bell telephone system, to work, it was important that something manufactured in New York, whatever that was, a relay amplifier, could be plugged in and implemented in San Francisco or Chicago or wherever. Standardization, therefore, was key, despite how boring it might sound to you. The second was all about the internal development of innovation. This is where Vail had lost that fight 20 years earlier. The system needed to onboard more users, the cost needed to come down, and the only way for Vail to pull that off was through innovation. Therefore, finally, he could redirect profits back from dividend payments into invention, innovation, and in-house development. Within this strategy, you really do see Theodore Vail's vision. He told everybody that the company was a system, almost a living system, a holistic thing. The idea was that if somebody had an improvement in California, it might be developed in New York and then reintegrated back into the system right across the United States. The systematic reintegration of components and new ideas into the system would have to happen, but only if things were seen holistically. This led to Theodore Vail's famous catchphrase, "One policy, one system, universal service." This was amazing. It worked internally because without context or a chain of command, everybody at AT&T knew exactly what to do. But it worked externally too. Customers wanted to pick up a telephone, make a call to any part of the United States and pay a single provider at the end of the month. They did not want to pay 2 different phone companies or 3 different phone companies, and they did not want to be rerouted through 10 different telephone exchanges. As we now meditate on the technical challenges that Theodore Vail faced with his one system and one policy and universal service, it's time to pause, to take a breath and return to where we started this podcast, with JJ Thomson back at the Cavendish. He was messing around, experimenting with the fluorescent light of his. It was affected by magnets. He had, in other words, recreated the Edison effect right there on his desk. Later, it proved that there was something in those tubes, something not related to the filament. These things were somehow smaller than an atom. They were subatomic. He had discovered the electron, the basic carrier of electrical current. However, in doing so, he also discovered a world of quantum theory where things that are smaller than an atom exist. It was a huge discovery. And in doing so, we finally had an explanation for what the Edison effect was. J.J. Thomson's observations, not dissimilar to Michael Faraday's observations, which were the scientific basis of technologies like dynamos and generators, were picked up and ran with. The person who ran with J.J. Thomson's scientific ideas was John Ambrose Fleming. Fleming had once worked in Edison's London branch. He was familiar with the Edison effect. He came up with the Fleming valve. The Fleming valve was a light bulb with a small copper plate inserted inside of it. Fleming realised that if a current passed through the plate, electrons, this new and peculiar subatomic particle, flowed across the vacuum. When the current in the plate was switched off, the electrons stopped flowing. Fleming called this a valve. The electrons, like water, were flowing or they were not flowing. It was a tap, essentially. In the United States, because this souped-up light bulb had 2 things inside of it, the Fleming valve became known as the diode. That all happened in 1904, the same year that Robert Hunter's book on poverty came out. 2 years later, in 1906, this souped-up light bulb got another addition, a third simple wire. Instead of the light bulb being switched on or off, the wire allowed the light bulb to act a bit like a dimmer switch. The flow of electrons could be on or off or anything in between. This new thing, the thing that Lee DeForest invented, because it had 3 things inside of it, became known as the triode. The 3 things were, of course, the filament, the copper plate, and that extra wire. The triode has been described by one historian as the truest little giant in all of history, perhaps the nearest approximation to an all-powerful genie that the brain of man ever created. Why? The triode did 3 things. First, it rectified an electrical current. That's to say, it changed AC into DC. Did you ever wonder why your battery gets hot on your laptop? That's because the alternating current that comes in from the mains is changing to direct current for your computer. This inefficient process has a side effect: heat. Second, the triode detected signals. Radio signals could be used to carry audio information, and a triode could help to extract the information from the carrier signal. Third, very importantly for the telephone, it amplified signals. The triode amplified a weak signal enough to drive a loud speaker. These three features destined the triode to be used inside the world's first computers, control systems, and at the turn of the last century, after Harold Arnold had finished with it, telecommunication systems. So we are now right back to where we started. 1901, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. 1904, the Fleming valve was invented at the same time that Robert Hunter's Poverty came out. 1906, DeForest invents the triode. 1907, Vail returns to AT&T, determined to use cutting-edge technology to build a system that serves all of America's citizens. In 1911, Vail hired a physicist named Harold Arnold. It's a classic example of a telephone native engineer and not a lawyer, the type of person who could take the system forward. Arnold's job was dead simple. He had to answer the question, how can we amplify a telephone signal so it could travel not just across town, but across the company? In other words, how could AT&T fulfill the mission it had been created to fulfill? Long-distance telephone calls, and finally offer itself as serious competition to the telegraph. Arnold got off to a few false starts, but then a year later, something rather extraordinary happened. He saw a demonstration from a man called Lee DeForest. He'd created something called the Audion. DeForest was a bit of a tinkerer, not unlike Edison before him. The difference between Edison and DeForest, though, is that DeForest didn't really know what he'd invented. But Arnold saw something and he realised DeForest's Audion potentially could be used to amplify an electrical signal. He bought the rights to DeForest's Audion. This is important. Theodore Vail, upon his return, wanted to collaborate with other inventors. So rather than reverse engineer the devices other inventors created and then fighting them in court, Vail wanted to license technology and then take it forward with his team of telephone native engineers. Unbelievably, and I think it's because he didn't know what he had, DeForest licensed the Audion to AT&T for only $50,000. Problem with the Audion, or the triode as it became known because it had three things inside of it, was that it only lasted about 50 hours before it failed. You can't build a system with universal service with components that only last 50 hours. But Ted Vail and Arnold, they were not messing around. By 1915, Arnold had 45 people working on the problem, including 7 PhDs in his team. Again, the lawyers are out and the people with the brains are in. And they had a deadline. The deadline is the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and it's penciled in for 1915. Vail wanted the transcontinental line to be ready. My God, history repeats itself, doesn't it? Once upon a time, Gardner Hubbard dragged Alexander Graham Bell to the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. That was back in 1876. And he got him to demonstrate the telephone to, of all people, Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil. Now, Arnold's got a deadline too, and they've got a place to showcase their work. The breakthrough came. Vacuum sealing. Arnold learned the lesson Edison had previously learned. The better the seal, the longer the bulb would last before the filaments or the wires burnt out. When Arnold had finished with improving this device, the triode could last 1,000 hours. This is how the triode in the hands of Howard Arnold became what they called the hard valve, but what we call the vacuum tube. It wasn't a little bit better, it was significantly better. The vacuum tube was positioned along strategic points between San Francisco and New York. That sounds a bit like Samuel Morse's Baltimore to Washington, D.C. experiment, doesn't it? And on January the 25th, 1915, that fateful conversation occurred. Alexander Graham Bell, an aging Alexander Graham Bell, spoke into the receiver. "Come here, Watson. I need you." Only for Watson to reply, "Well, this time it would take me 5 days to get there." The world's first transcontinental telephone call had just been made. Alexander Graham Bell was in New York. Thomas Watson was in California. The vacuum tube, because it enabled long-distance telephone calls, was the final nail in the coffin of the telegraph. It was hammered into it by Theodore Vail, of all people, the first cousin of Alfred Vail, who had previously made the telegraph possible. Of course, it wasn't really a nail in a coffin, was it? Because the telephone, its original name, the harmonic telegraph, was simply the next evolution of that technology. It itself was a type of telegraph. What had Theodore Vail actually done? Fulfilled the mission of AT&T to create a system that could handle long-distance phone calls? Yes, he'd done that. But what had he really done? He'd refreshed the company. He'd refreshed the workforce, brought processes in and management structures. The vacuum tube was simply the latest gadget that would allow him to create a system that delivered a universal service. So really, what you see in the case of the vacuum tube is it's the first serious result of Theodore Vail's strategy. It would not be the last. Not long after the success with the vacuum tube, in June 1918, Theodore Vail's worst fears came true. For national security reasons, the government nationalises AT&T. The postmaster, that was the job Theodore Vail once held, the Postmaster General Albert Burleson said, "If the efficient management and direction is given the telegraph and telephone that has been given the postal service, the probability is that they will never be returned to private control." Oh my God, the very thing Vail had worked so hard to overcome with the Kingsbury Commitment had now come to pass. The question remained, will the government ever give AT&T back? Well, actually, this was just a temporary thing. It's less in the psyche and nature of the United States and the people who live there to nationalise their industry. It all stinks too much of socialism and communism, which the Americans, it's fair to say, have got a bit of an allergy to. So in 1919, the government returned AT&T to private hands. Theodore Vail had dodged a bullet. What he couldn't dodge, though, was the passing of time. Theodore Vail was getting old, but he knew that, and his strategy was meant to outlive him. All the things he put in place were literally in place to make sure that his vision of one system and one policy and universal service outlived him, not by a few years, but by decades. With this in mind, one of the first things he did was bring in a generous pension scheme. He needed to bind all of his telephone native leaders, managers and engineers, in fact all of the people at AT&T, whether they worked on the switchboard or worked in manufacturing, he needed to bind them to AT&T for their whole lifetime. The second thing he did, this by the way from a hard-nosed American capitalist, was bringing in disability payments. This meant if somebody was sick, they could be nursed back to productive health while being fully paid. The third thing he did, which was revolutionary for the time, was to bring in opportunities for employees to buy stock in AT&T. We think of this as a modern invention, and in fact historians of technology talk about Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who founded Intel, being the first people to do this properly. But actually Theodore Vail had beaten them to the punch by about 50 years. To go along with all of these management changes, there was one other thing that Theodore Vail did. If he was to pull it off, his vision of one system, one policy with universal service, he needed to pull down barriers. How could everybody feel part of AT&T if there was a hierarchy between white-collar and blue-collar workers? How could manufacturing and research and development get along? Traditionally, they hated each other. R&D kept inventing things that couldn't be plugged into the system or couldn't be manufactured at scale. In this regard, Vail was light years ahead of his time. He started to rip down the barriers between managers and workers. This is an important source of what we nowadays call psychological safety. How did he do that? One of the things he did was with a regular newsletter. The newsletter was full of technical articles. It was a way to share knowledge. If somebody did something in New York, then somebody in San Francisco could, for example, learn about it. The newsletter, for example, was where they explained how the vacuum tube worked or how switches worked. But there were also photographs of family members and photographs of the women who worked at AT&T. There was even a woman's section in the newsletters. So the barriers between R&D and manufacturing came down, the barriers between blue and white-collar workers came down, and Theodore Vail normalised an organisation that had women working inside of it. If I turn to Louis Galambos' 1992 paper, Galambos is a historian and a historian of technology. He asks a very important question. Did these efforts at socialisation matter at all? Did they have any impact on either the managers or the shop floor workers? Well, apparently they did, because in combination with the procedural changes in employee relationships, they produced a formidable culture throughout the whole Bell system. And that was, of course, Theodore Vail's idea. Everybody calls it the system. This formidable culture of Vail's, rooted in what we call psychological safety, was all about ripping down barriers between management and staff. Those who directed the work and those who did the work worked closely together. He created a culture where there was a high degree of conversational turn-taking. That is just a very technical way of saying people were respectful to each other. And he created a culture of empathy. Together, those are the two cornerstones of psychological safety: empathy and conversational turn-taking. All of this started at the top. You've got the man in charge saying, let's break down the barriers between blue and white-collar workers. We're all in this together. He features inside the newsletter not just stories of technology and advances in R&D, but of the escapades from the factory floor. All of a sudden, everybody at AT&T are living in each other's pockets. They have the same vision, the same goal. They are all financially incentivized for the company to do well. If they get sick, they'll get looked after. Together, they are now part of a remarkable community. What we are now left with is a coherent view of what Ted Vail had started to do. It began with cost-cutting, but it was really just the first step in a much broader talent management and acquisition strategy. He fought off the government with the Kingsbury Commitment. His talent management system then really kicked in. Telephone native engineers and managers and leaders were brought in to replace the lawyer. This was the cornerstone moment. People who thought like Ted Vail, who believed in one policy, one system, and universal service were in. The lawyers and the patent trolls were out. These were the people who would take AT&T into the future. They would run with Vail's ideas, his newsletters, his psychologically safe workplace, and they would continue to pull the barriers long after Ted Vail had retired again. They would continue to build and invent a system that worked not just for employees, but for their customers, and that worked for Uncle Sam too. To put Vail's remarkable victory in context, you've got to remember that he was nearly 62 when he came back to AT&T. He'd already destroyed Western Union in that court case all those years earlier, itself a pretty stunning victory. But when he retired in 1919, after a 12-year burst of energy, he was 73 going on 74. He'd fought off all the bad guys. He'd fought the stupidity of the Bell Telephone Company itself. He fought Uncle Sam. He refreshed the whole workforce, and he'd done so within the context of some of the most difficult economic times the United States had ever seen. The First World War was raging in the background, and that was used to justify AT&T's nationalisation. My goodness, what an adventure. It is almost time to say goodbye to Theodore Vail and his wonderful story. But before we wrap the podcast up, and for reasons that are about to come extremely clear, we need to step back just one more time and look at the story of the technology that made all of this possible. The story of the triode and the story of AT&T and Ted Vail's strategy become the same thing around 1912. And as we just heard, it was Harold Arnold, a telephone native engineer, not a lawyer, who took DeForest's triode that lasted for 50 hours and changed it into a vacuum tube that would last 1,000 hours. The vacuum tube was the device that was positioned along strategic points between San Francisco and New York that allowed Watson and Alexander Graham Bell to make the first transcontinental telephone call in January 1915. Not long after Ted Vail set off into retirement, AT&T kept his vision alive. In 1924, it managed to kill two birds with one stone. AT&T needed a way to systematically develop new technologies that would bring the telephone to everybody and thus make it a genuinely universal service. That was the first bird. AT&T also had to make sure that profits were kept low. That was hard to do because they had achieved their goal and became a natural monopoly. But if they were to avoid the wrath of the monopoly-busting government, they needed to eradicate profits. That was the second bird. The stone that killed them both was a company that AT&T founded called Bell Labs. Bell Labs was fully dependent on AT&T. Its stock was not for sale, it would never be profitable. Its managers and those at AT&T weighed every decision against what they thought the Department of Justice might do. Bell Labs was, in other words, a weird company, but its purpose was singular: to develop a system with universal service. Bell Labs became Theodore Vail's enduring legacy. Another laboratory, but this one is well lit. We're not at the Cavendish anymore or stuck out at Menlo Park. On a desk sits a thing. Two scientists have passed a current through it. It's got that in common with Thomson's cathode ray tube and Edison's light bulb. But there are no filaments here. Instead, a rock of some kind, some wires and gold leaf. It's not silicon, it's germanium, named after the country Germany. Another current, but something changes. The rock is doing three separate things. It can rectify a current, it can amplify a signal, and it can modulate radio waves. It can do exactly what the vacuum tube already does. The boffins at Bell Labs would later give this peculiar rock a name. They would call it the transistor. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.